So as I mentioned, we have this React context concept, which allows us to manage state kind of behind the scenes in React, such that we actually are able to directly change it from any component in our app and directly pass it to any component in our app without building such a prop chain. For that, here in my source folder, next to my components folder, I will add a new folder, context, and you don't have to name it context. You could also name it state or store. Often such an app-wide state is also named store, so maybe let's go with that. And in there, I'll add a new file. And since we're going to manage some authentication state, I will add a auth context in there. So hence, I will name the file authcontext.js. The exact naming is up to you though. You could also name it auth context like this, so in this Pascal case notation, but this would imply that we're going to store a component in there, and that's not directly what we're doing. Hence, I'll go for this naming using kebab case. So auth context.js, and I can say right away, you can have multiple contexts for multiple global states in your app. And of course, you can also use just one context for a bigger state. That's all up to you, but let's maybe just learn how context works. So we get the auth context.js file. And in there, we import React from React as if we would build a component, but we're not going to do that. Instead, on React, I'm going to call create context. And this does what the name implies. It creates such a context object in the end. Now, create context takes a default context. And context here really is just your app or component-wide state. So it's up to you what that state should be. It could be something simple like just a string, my state. If your app-wide or component-wide state is just some text, you could have some, well, text as your default state. Often though, it will be an object. It will be an object where you, for example, in our case, manage the isLoggedIn state and set this to false initially, let's say. Now what we get back from create context is something interesting though. It will be a component, or it will be an object that also contains components. Let's put it like this. So we get back auth context, and I'll name it like this because whilst auth context itself is not a component, it is an object that will contain a component. Now we don't need this object here though. Instead, we'll need it in the other components. So I'll export it as a default to make it available in other files. So now we can import this specific context object. And to then use context in your app, you need to do two things. You need to provide it, which basically tells React, hey, here's my context. All components that are wrapped by it should have access to it. And I'll come back to that wrapping part in a second. And besides providing, you then need to consume it. You need to hook into it. You need to listen to it, if you want to call it like this. Now, providing is always the first step. Providing means that you wrap in JSX code all the components that should be able to tap into that context, so that should be able to listen to that context. Any component that's not wrapped will not be able to listen. So here, if we know that we need this context everywhere in the entire application, so in all components possibly, we want to wrap everything in app component with it. If we knew that we only needed, let's say, in the login component and its child components, we could only wrap the login component. But here we'll need it in the main header, we'll need it down there, we'll need it everywhere. So therefore, we can wrap our main header and this main section with auth context, and for that we'll need to import it. So make sure you add this import from store auth context to import this auth context object. And I said that this itself wouldn't be a component. In JSX, we need a component though. But with a dot, we can access a property on this auth context object that contains a component. And that's the provider. Auth context provider is a component we can use in our JSX code, and we can wrap it around other components. And those other components and all their descendant components, so all their children and their children's children and so on, all those components will now have access to that context. Now, since we use auth context as a wrapper here, we can now technically also use React fragment because we got this wrapping component as a root level component I return here. And with that, the main header, but also the login and the home component and all their children will have access to auth context. So now we provide this. Now we have the second part, and that is the listening part. To get access to our value, which at the moment is always just this default value, which never changes, we're going to work on that too, of course, but to have access to that value, we need to listen. And we can listen in two ways. We can listen by using auth context consumer or by using a React hook. Now, we'll typically use the React hook, but let me show you the other alternative to consumer as well. Let's say here, in navigation, we're interested in knowing whether the user is authenticated or not. For that, we can also use auth context there and wrap everything where we need data from it with that consumer. So here, for example, we could wrap the entire component with auth context. Again, make sure to import it, of course. Dot consumer now. Previously, we had the provider. Now we have the consumer. The consumer works a bit differently, though. The consumer takes a child, which actually should be a function between curly braces like this. And as an argument, you'll get your context data. So in our case, you'll get this object here. And then in this function, you should return your JSX code, which should have access to that data. So here I'm grabbing all that nav code, I'm returning that, and in there I now, for example, have access to ctx.isLoggedIn because my context object is this object here, and there I have the isLoggedIn prop. Now if you save that, you will however see, if you reload, that this crashes. And the reason for that is that we do have a default value here, but this default value will actually only be used if we would consume here without having a provider. So technically the provider is not even needed. However, you should memorize this pattern I explained earlier where you need the provider. Technically, you don't need it if you have a default value, but in reality, you will use context to have a value which can change, and that will only be possible with a provider. So therefore, to make sure that this does not crash, let's go back to the provider. And there, on the provider component, you can add a value prop. And this has to be named value, because this is not a component by you. And to that, you can also pass your object. So in this case, I will just repeat my default object here. But now you would be able to change that object, for example, through state in the app component. And whenever it changes, the new value will be passed down to all consuming components. But that is something I will also come back to in a second. So here, let me save this, and now it reloads without problems. Now, of course, if I now log in, you will see that we only have one link here. So that first link, the user's link, is missing because there I'm pulling data from my context, and that at the moment is never changing. So let's make sure we can change it before I then show you the alternative to the consumer. Here, changing it is easy. We have set up the provider here in the app component, and there we manage the isLoggedIn state anyways. So instead of hard coding our isLoggedIn value in the value we pass to the provider, we can set it to isLoggedIn, of course. And if we do that, this value object will be updated by React whenever isLoggedIn changed. And that new object, that new context object, will be passed down to all listening components. So to all components where we consume this context. The difference to before is that we don't need to use a prop to forward that, therefore. Instead, we just set it on the provider, and then everywhere in all child components, we can listen to that. So here we could remove the isAuthenticated prop on the main header, and in the main header, therefore, stop forwarding it to the navigation. And in navigation, we could now use context.isLoggedIn everywhere where we need the isLoggedIn information. And that's now where we break up that props chain, where we stop forwarding that data, which we don't need in the main header, and where we instead leverage context. So now if I reload, you see that still works, and now the link is back, but now we're using context here. Now I did mention, however, that the consumer is just one way of consuming our context. It's an okayish way, but I don't like that syntax too much, having that function that then returns our code. You can do that, but there actually is a more elegant way, a more elegant solution using the use context hook.